Summer 1941. The world holds its breath. The colossal machinery of Operation Barbarossa has unleashed hell upon the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht, hitherto undefeated, smashes through border defenses, drunk on the speed of blitzkrieg. Because of the sheer shock and ferocity of the assault, the Red Army reels backward in chaotic disarray, losing hundreds of miles in mere weeks. While the central thrust aims for Moscow, immense attention turns south, to Ukraine, the industrial heartland, the breadbasket of the USSR. Leading the German drive here is Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South. His objective is clear: seize the Dnieper River and the jewel of Kiev. Standing in his way is the massive Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos. On paper, a formidable force of nearly 700,000 men. But geography plays a cruel role in this unfolding tragedy. The vast, impassable Pripyat marshes create a natural 200-mile void, separating the German army groups. By August, the lightning advance slows. The immense distances of Russia begin to choke the German logistical chains. Engines fail in the endless dust. Crucially, Army Group Center, racing toward Moscow faster than its neighbors, exposes its long southern flank to the Pripyat marshlands. Hanging threateningly on that exposed flank is Kirponos's massive concentration of Soviet armies around Kiev, a dormant giant that Berlin cannot ignore. Deep inside the Wolf's Lair headquarters, Adolf Hitler makes a decision that will pivot the entire war. His generals demand Moscow, the political heart. But Hitler eyes the economics of Ukraine, the coal of the Donbas, the grain to feed his Reich. Because the dictator prioritizes resources over the capital, he issues the fateful Führer Directive 33. The order is stunning: halt the direct drive on Moscow. Divert the precious panzer divisions south to annihilate the Soviet forces in Ukraine. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Panzer Arm, is furious. He flies to headquarters to argue that Moscow is the prize, but his protests are overruled. With grim obedience, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, the armored spearhead aimed at Stalin's throat, executes a massive, complex 90-degree turn. They swing south, a steel hammer descending behind the Soviet armies defending Kiev. The trap begins to form. Simultaneously, far to the south, Ewald von Klest's 1st Panzer Group smashes across the lower Dnieper, the anvil rising to meet the hammer. The German plan is a gigantic double pincer movement, a strategic ballet designed to swallow an entire Soviet army group whole. Inside Kiev, General Kirponos sees the geometry of disaster on his maps. The jaws are visible, and they are closing fast. Kirponos desperately begs Moscow for permission to withdraw behind the Dnieper, to save his 700,000 men to fight another day. The response from the Kremlin is chilling in its brevity: stand fast, hold Kiev, no retreat. Because Stalin fears the political symbolism of losing Ukraine more than the loss of an army, he paralyzes his generals with the terror of execution. So the Soviet soldiers dig in along the western banks of the Dnieper, unaware they are already inside a cage that is being locked from the outside. Early September. The weather turns. The summer dust transforms into the infamous Rasputitsa, the clinging, bottomless Russian mud. Yet the German panzers push on, churning through the sludge, driven by the relentless momentum of the encirclement plan. The gap between Guderian's tanks thrusting from the north and Klest's from the south shrinks daily. 200 kilometers, then 100. Soviet desperate counterattacks are thrown piecemeal against their armored spearheads, only to be shattered by superior German tactics and air power. The roads leading east out of the impending pocket become choked with terrified refugees and retreating support troops, perfect targets for the Luftwaffe. the ticking bomb reaches zero. The stage is finally set for the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. September 14th, 1941. The town of Lovitsia, 120 miles east of Kiev. The dusty horizon is broken by the silhouette of approaching armor. It is the moment of doom. The lead elements of Mardel's 3rd Panzer Division from the north spot the reconnaissance units of the 16th Panzer Division from the south. The steel clamp snaps shut. The hammer has met the anvil. The encirclement is complete, trapping the Soviet southwestern front in a bag the size of Switzerland. Inside this pocket are 5 entire Soviet armies, 45 divisions, over 600,000 men. It is the largest single concentration of troops ever surrounded in military history. Panic spreads like a virus through the Soviet command frequencies. "We are surrounded," screams the radio. "Where are the orders? Where is the fuel?" But in Moscow, the denial is absolute. Stalin refuses to believe the map, insisting that the encirclement is merely a panic-induced rumor spread by defeatists. Because of this delusion, the precious hours that could have been used for a coordinated breakout are wasted in paralyzed silence. September 16th. Finally, Marshal Timoshenko issues a verbal authorization to retreat. But there is a catch. There is no written order, no paper trail to protect the commanders from execution. By the time the official retreat order arrives on September 17th, it is a death warrant. The German ring has hardened from a thin line of tanks into a wall of infantry. The Kessel, the cauldron, begins to boil. The Germans do not just hold the line. They squeeze, compressing the Soviet armies into a smaller and smaller killing box. With the roads clogged by miles of stalled vehicles, the Luftwaffe begins a free hunt. It is not a battle, it is target practice. German pilots report that they don't even need to aim. The concentration of Soviet troops is so dense that every bomb finds flesh or metal. On the ground, the Soviet logistics collapse. Tanks run dry of fuel and become static pillboxes. Artillery pieces out of shells are spiked and abandoned in the mud. Desperation breeds madness. Isolated Soviet units, cut off from command, launch suicidal bayonet charges against dug-in German machine guns. They charge with the courage of the doomed, shouting era, only to be mown down in windrows like wheat before a scythe. Meanwhile, inside the city of Kiev, the end has arrived. On September 19th, the Red Army abandons the Ukrainian capital, leaving it to the invaders. But the Soviets leave a parting gift. As German troops march triumphantly past the Continental Hotel and the Citadel, the ground trembles. Thousands of delayed action mines, planted by the NKVD, detonate in sequence. Entire city blocks disintegrate, burying hundreds of German occupiers in the rubble. Yet, the explosion in Kiev is a sideshow. The real tragedy is unfolding in the forests to the east, where General Kirponos and his entire staff are fighting for their lives. The command group, the brain of the southwestern front, is wandering the woods, cut off from their armies, radio dead, hunted by German patrols. September 20th. Shumakov Grove. The German 3rd Panzer Division corners the Soviet headquarters column. There is no escape. General Kirponos, the man who tried to save his army, dies not in a command bunker, but in a muddy ditch, weapon in hand. With him dies the Chief of Staff and the political commissar. The Southwestern Front is effectively decapitated. The death of the leadership sends the final wave of hopelessness through the cauldron. Resistance does not end, it splinters. The cohesive army dissolves into thousands of small, starving groups, hiding in ravines, fighting for survival rather than victory. The German ring tightens mercilessly. The space between the prison walls shrinks, forcing the prisoners to walk over the bodies of their comrades. It is no longer a battle. It is a harvest. Their ammunition is gone. The food is gone. The hope is gone. The only thing remaining is the sheer, overwhelming number of human beings waiting to be captured. As the guns fall silent sector by sector, a new sound rises, the shuffling of hundreds of thousands of boots marching into captivity. The Battle of Kiev is ending. The tragedy of the POWs is just beginning. The numbers defy comprehension. German field clerks, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of humanity, struggle to tally the captives. Berlin claims 665,000 prisoners, a number larger than the entire population of many European capitals. The footage of these endless columns is rushed to cinemas across the Reich. It is the ultimate propaganda coup, proof of the Wehrmacht's invincibility. But for the men in those columns, the reality is a descent into hell. Stripped of winter coats and boots, they are marched westward into starvation. Most will never see their homes again. Of the millions captured in 1941, the survival rate will be less than 3%. For Adolf Hitler, this is the supreme moment of vindication. He had overruled his generals, sent the tanks south, and achieved the greatest encirclement in history. He declares to the world that the Soviet enemy is broken, that the Red Army is a beast that has been bled dry. But in the euphoria of victory, a dangerous arrogance takes root. The High Command believes the war is effectively won, that the road to Moscow is now open and undefended. Yet the golden thread of causality begins to tighten around the German neck. The victory at Kiev has come with a hidden, exorbitant price tag. Time. The one resource Germany cannot manufacture. The diversion to Kiev has consumed 4 critical weeks of the summer campaigning season. The panzer divisions, the metallic fist of the Blitzkrieg, are no longer the pristine force they were in June. The tracks are worn, the engines are clogging, and the men are fatigued. The detour south has added thousands of kilometers of wear and tear to the machines. General Guderian knows this. As he turns his tanks back toward the north, aiming once again for Moscow, he feels a chill in the air that has nothing to do with fear. The Russian autumn is ending. The nights are growing longer. The mud is beginning to freeze. Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow, is finally authorized. But it is starting a month late, in a race against the thermometer. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, the catastrophe at Kiev creates a terrifying vacuum. A gaping hole, hundreds of miles wide, has been torn in the southern front. Stalin, shaken by the scale of the loss, finally sheds his delusions. He recalls Marshal Zhukov from Leningrad to save the crumbling center. The Soviet Union is not dead. It is wounded, bleeding profusely, but it is mobilizing with the fury of a cornered animal. New armies are being raised from the population. Untrained, poorly equipped, but numbering in the millions. They are thrown into the breach to buy time with their blood. Back in Kiev, the occupation begins. The jewel of Ukraine enters a period of darkness that will last for 2 long years. The explosion of the citadel by the NKVD gives their occupiers a pretext for a horror that will stain the history of humanity. While the script of war focuses on armies, the script of genocide begins in a ravine known as WWII. The terror in the rear areas ensures that the Soviet partisan movement begins to grow. The conquerors have sown dragon's teeth. By early October, the focus of the world shifts. The eyes of history turn away from the south and look toward the center, toward Moscow. The panzer groups of Hoth, Reinhardt, and Guderian align for the final strike. The greatest armored force ever assembled is ready to end the war. But as the engines roar to life for the drive on Moscow, the ground beneath them is no longer the dust of summer. The Battle of Kiev was a tactical masterpiece for Germany, but strategically, it may have been the error that lost them the war. They have won the prize of Ukraine, but they have lost the prize of time. And in Russia, time is the deadliest weapon of all. The stage is set for the climax of 1941. The typhoon is coming. And the ghosts of Kiev, the 600,000 lost souls, watch from the silence of history. While the common soldiers march into captivity, the fate of the Soviet High Command reads like a Greek tragedy of cowardice and sacrifice. Marshal Semyon Budyonny, the mustachioed cavalry legend from the Civil War, had seen the trap closing days before Kerponos. Stalin had dismissed Budyonny for daring to suggest retreat. Yet, as the ring snapped shut, Budyonny was flown out on the last Dakota aircraft, leaving his men behind. Contrast this with Nikita Khrushchev, the future leader of the Soviet Union, then a political commissar. He barely escapes the encirclement, fleeing on foot through the sunflower fields. The chaos of the breakout attempts creates a fog of war, so thick that neither Berlin nor Moscow knows who is alive or dead. For weeks after the official surrender, the pacification of the pocket continues. The German rearguard is forced to fight thousands of small, vicious skirmishes. These are not battles for territory. They are battles for bread, for boots, for a chance to slip into the forests and vanish. The strain on German logistics is immense. Instead of resting for the Moscow push, the infantry divisions are exhausted by the grueling work of guarding 600,000 prisoners. Vehicles that should be refitting are instead driving in circles, hunting down remnants of the Red Army. Every mile driven is a mile subtracted from the drive on Moscow. Meanwhile, inside the conquered city of Kiev, the Wehrmacht encounters a new, terrifying form of warfare, the scorched earth. The Soviets had rigged the city's infrastructure to self-destruct. The power grid fails. The water pumps stop. The fire stations are sabotaged. When the delayed action mines detonate along the Kreshchatik, the main thoroughfare, the fires rage uncontrollably for days. German engineers, masters of traditional warfare, are baffled. They are fighting a ghost enemy that strikes from beneath the cobblestones. In retaliation, the occupation authority initiates a brutal crackdown. The rules of war are discarded entirely on the Eastern Front. The city of Kiev, once a bustling metropolis of nearly 1 million, becomes a ghost town. The population is decimated by hunger and deportation. The German administration views the remaining civilians not as people, but as useless eaters. Ration cards are denied to anyone not working for the Wehrmacht. This cruelty is a strategic error. By treating the Ukrainians as subhumans rather than liberators, the Germans squander a massive potential alliance. Many Ukrainians, who had initially suffered under Stalin and welcomed the Germans, now realize they have simply traded one tyrant for another. Disillusionment turns into resistance. The weapons discarded in their encirclement are dug up by the survivors. The partisan war begins. The vast forests around Kiev, the very terrain that trapped the regular army, now become the fortress of the irregulars. Trains carrying supplies to the front begin to derail. Bridges explode mysteriously. The German supply lines are bleeding from 1,000 paper cuts. Back at Army Group South headquarters, Field Marshal von Rundstedt is growing uneasy. He has conquered the land, but he does not control it. He writes to Berlin, warning that the space of Russia is swallowing his army. But his warnings are drowned out by the propaganda of victory. The victory at Kiev has created a dangerous paradox. The map shows a solid front, but the reality is a porous, fragile screen. The infantry divisions are stretched so thin that a single sentry must guard 1 kilometer of front. They are isolated, cold, and vulnerable. And winter is no longer coming. It is here. The first heavy snows fall in late October, covering the bodies of the unburied dead. The mud freezes into rock-hard ruts. This helps the tanks move again, but it freezes the oil in the guns and the blood in the veins. The German army is still fighting in summer uniforms. The winter clothing is stuck in Poland, delayed by the very logistical crisis caused by the Kiev diversion. As November approaches, the focus of the war leaves Ukraine. The cameras depart. The generals depart. But the Battle of Kiev has one final act to play. Its legacy will determine the fate of the typhoon that is now raging toward Moscow. Voice English. December 1941. The outskirts of Moscow. General Guderian, the architect of the Kiev trap, stands in the turret of his command tank. Through his lenses, he can reportedly see the spires of the Kremlin. They are tantalizingly close, just 20 kilometers away. But his tanks are not moving. The oil in their sumps has turned to tar. The firing pins shatter like glass in the -40-degree cold. This is the price of Kiev. The 6 weeks spent annihilating Kerponos in the south are the exact 6 weeks missing now in the center. Had the panzers driven straight for Moscow in August, they would have rolled on dry summer roads. They would have faced a disorganized enemy. Instead, they strike a wall. Not just a wall of ice, but a wall of fresh steel. While the Germans were busy counting prisoners in Ukraine, Stalin used the bought time to pull his ace from the sleeve, the Siberian divisions. These men are masters of winter warfare. They do not freeze. They attack. On December 5th, the Red Army launches a massive counteroffensive. The exhausted Wehrmacht, stretched to the breaking point, snaps. For the first time in World War II, the German war machine is forced into a chaotic retreat. The myth of invincibility dies in the snowdrifts of Russia. The victory at Kiev was a tactical masterpiece, a canny of the modern age. But strategically, it was the seduction that led to Germany's doom. By prioritizing the economic wealth of Ukraine over the political heart of Moscow, Hitler won a battle, but lost the war. And what of the prize? What of Kiev? The city remains under the jackboot for 2 grim years. The breadbasket feeds Germany, while the people of Kiev starve. But the tide turns. In November 1943, the Red Army returns. Not as the disorganized rabble of 1941, but as a mechanized juggernaut. They liberate a ruin. The city that Kerponos died to defend is a shell. Its population has shrunk from 900,000 to 180,000. The liberators discover the horrors of their occupation. The ravines of Babaïa yield their terrible secrets to the world. The Battle of Kiev in 1941 was the largest encirclement in military history, a record of suffering that stands unbroken. Of the 665,000 men captured in that cauldron, barely 20,000 ever returned home. They died in the transit camps, in the open rail cars, and in the slave labor factories of the Reich. General Kerponos, whose body was hidden by locals, was eventually disinterred and buried with honors. A statue now watches over the city he could not save. Today, the battlefields of 1941 are quiet farm fields. The sunflowers grow tall over the unmarked graves. But every year, the earth pushes something to the surface. A rusted helmet, a corroded medal, a bone. The iron harvest reminds us that the land remembers what the history books sometimes forget. The Battle of Kiev teaches a brutal lesson, that a perfect tactical victory can be a strategic suicide. It demonstrates that in the vastness of the East, space and time are more powerful than gunpowder and steel. We remember the generals who moved the pins on the map, but we must honor the millions who were the pins. The men who stood fast at the Dnieper, the men who walked into the captivity, the men who vanished into the mist. 1941, the year the world held its breath, and the fields of Ukraine were stained red forever. This was the Battle of Kiev,